Right now, let's talk about, the ongoing issues we have in this country when it comes to strikes. Rail strikes again today from the RMT, second day of a 48-hour strike. That will still hit again tomorrow when ASLEF train drivers are going on strike. And then we've got more RMT workers going out on strike on Friday and Saturday. We've got more nurses strikes coming up, more paramedics, ambulance drivers. And, of course, we've got Highways Agency, driving instructors. You name it, DVSA. We've also got possibility of doctors going on strike. They've got a strike ballot ending next week. And, indeed, teaching unions as well. Across the board, civil servants, bin men in some parts of the country, we are seeing these issues. Well, Paul Novak is the General Secretary of the TUC since last summer, and he's been calling for an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister in a bid to break the industrial disputes sweeping the country. And I'm delighted to say he joins us right now. Good morning to you.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. Why do you want an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister? What will that resolve?
Well, I think what we need is a meeting with the Prime Minister to reset our public services, because the reality is, Julia, regardless of the strikes that are taking place, and as you said, they're taking place right across our public sector, what we're seeing is staffing crises in large parts of the public sector. 133,000 staff vacancies in our NHS at the moment. And another real terms pay cut for nurses and paramedics isn't going to help us address that problem. The Prime Minister will talk today about the need to teach maths in our schools. We've got a chronic shortage of maths teachers. 40% of new teachers leave the job within 5 years. Again, another real terms pay cut is going to help that situation. So we think it's time for the government to sit down, to talk seriously to unions and to staff about how we rebuild our public services. And crucially, I want to make the point to him that he needs to empower his ministers to be able to sit round a table with our unions, negotiate a fair pay rise for public sector workers and put an end to these strikes.
You say it's, getting face-to-face with someone, seeing the whites of their eyes always helps when you're trying to come to a deal. And we know that Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, meeting with the RMT leadership, perhaps may smooth the way to a possible resolution there in a way that Grant Shapps, the former Transport Secretary, never did. But fundamentally, it's going to come down to money, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't matter how supportive or nice or agreeing you can all be. If you sit down with Rishi Sunak and he says, as the Prime Minister, there's no more money, end of, full stop. No sitting around, no cups of tea and bourbons is going to make any difference, is it?
Well, I'm not looking for tea and sympathy, Julia, and I'm not looking for beer and sandwiches in number 10 either. I'm looking for a straight discussion about public sector pay and how we rebuild our public services.
And what is that? That straight discussion is we need to pay people in the public sector a lot more.
No, it's going to come down to political choices. So, the government could decide if it wanted to tax more heavily the profits of the oil and gas giants. It could decide to equalise capital gains tax with income tax. That alone would raise around £17 billion, enough to pay the lion's share of a decent pay rise in the public sector. But the only way you resolve disputes is by sitting down and reaching agreement. And at the moment, the government is refusing to even enter into a basic negotiation. And I don't think that the Prime Minister can wish away the staffing crisis in the NHS. You either want an NHS that is there to provide support and services to patients and to the public when you need them, or you don't. And if you do want it, you're going to have to pay for it.
But this is it, though. Fundamentally, it is going to be about the money. It's about how you raise that money. And basically, if you're going to raise that money, you're going to be putting taxes up on... I mean, the countries around, particularly around Europe, that have got healthcare services, which they don't have waiting lists, and you've got far more beds and doctors and nurses per head of the population. They actually have, and I talked to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, pretty much the most respected body on this, about this in detail. They were saying, they don't just tax the very rich more or have a higher corporation tax. They tax the average man and woman a lot more. The average person on average income pays a lot more tax to pay for those better services than we are taxed right now. And perhaps a lot of people will feel they can, A, want to pay, and B, can afford to pay. You can give people a pay rise, and at the very same time, to pay for that pay rise, people in the public sector and the private sector will probably end up having to be taxed more.
Well, there's a couple of things to say there, Julia. I mean, first of all, the experience that you described isn't a universal one. I was in Spain a couple of months ago talking to Spanish unions and the work that they've been doing with their new governments. They've introduced a wealth tax in Spain on those with wealth over €3 million. Actually, if you look at satisfaction with their health service, they're the most satisfied out of all of the OECD countries. So the choices governments make can make a difference. But at the moment, low pay costs us as well. 1 in 10 civil servants are claiming the benefits that they themselves administer. I mean, this is crazy that people who work in the public sector are having to claim in-work tax credits and benefits. So you know, this isn't a crisis that's been a year or two in the making, Julia. This is 10 years now of real terms pay cuts. The average nurse will be £4,000 a year better off if her wages had gone up just by inflation. Not inflation busting, just by inflation. So the government need to do something about this, and they could start by sitting down and having meaningful discussions with the unions. And
this is where a lot of this is going to come down to public support or lack of support for any strike action, isn't it? There's a lot of thought that I think within government, from the ministers and the sources I talk to, that certainly with the rail strikers, you know, there may be an agreement, may not, but actually they haven't got a wealth of support. A lot of people might say they support them, but actually they don't really care. They don't get trains from one year to the next. Certainly they don't commute anymore. People who used to commute now working from home. It's a bit of a shrug of the shoulders. We all care about the healthcare service, because I don't think there's a single person, you, me, anyone working in this office, anyone listening or watching right now, who doesn't either have a personal experience from them, their family, their friends, their colleagues, their neighbours who've experienced some sort of delay. And we're seeing there's 500 excess deaths a week. It's now claimed in the NHS as a result of delays in getting care. But the question is, in terms of this, is how quickly can we resolve any of this, and how much throwing extra money at the problem is going to resolve things? And people may feel very sympathetic, say, oh yes, let's pay nurses more. A lot of those people may not realise the sort of money that nurses are on, but they may be very sympathetic that, yes, they've had real terms pay cut, completely accept that. But the reality is, most people in this country don't work in the public sector, they work in the private sector, and they are not seeing inflation-proof pay rises, either in the last 10 years or indeed in this year. So why should public sector workers get that, when most private sector workers aren't? And by the way, if they did, that would just see prices going up for everything else that we buy, pushing up inflation even more.
Well, listen, Julia, I'm not interested in sort of driving a wedge between low-paid supermarket workers and low-paid care home workers. I want to see all of those workers get a pay rise. I mean, it's important to say there's absolutely no evidence at all, and the government, I think, would have to admit this, that inflation is driving, that wages are driving inflation in this country. I mean, we could look at profits up 31% last year alone, dividends rising 3 times faster than wages, bumper year for the bonuses in the City of London last year. So not everybody's living through a cost of living crisis. And, you know, I actually think public support is holding up for rail workers as well as for health workers. Everybody, well, I think most people accept that when you've got no alternative and you feel that your employer isn't listening to you, you should have that fundamental right to strike. And nobody likes a train strike, least of all the people who work in our rail industry. They want to be at work delivering the service that they're proud to deliver. I think in rail, with a little bit of support from government, a little bit more flex, there's a deal to be done, a deal that delivers on pay but also on working conditions and on no compulsory redundancies. But again, the keys to unlocking all of these disputes, I'm afraid to say, lie at the doors at number 10 and 11 Downing Street.
OK, but...
You know, Rishi Sunak can't hide away from that, Julia. He's going to have to respond and come out and talk to us at some point.
Well, when it comes to, say, the nurses, the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary have often said, look, there's an independent pay review body that set the amount that nurses would get. There isn't an independent pay review body for the railways. You've said this morning that the Prime Minister is using those independent pay review bodies as a human shield. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is he's hiding behind the pay review bodies. He knows full well that when the pay review bodies were gathering evidence, it was his government that told them that they were operating within a certain financial envelope. He knows full well as well that when those pay review bodies were gathering their evidence, inflation wasn't running at 10 or 11%. And he knows full well that he does have the ability, if he wishes to, completely consistent with the pay review bodies, to step up and negotiate additional pay arrangements with public sector workers. It's what's happened in the NHS back in 2018. There was a deal done between the government and unions for a 3-year pay deal. So, you know, don't hide behind the pay review bodies. Don't damage the credibility of the pay review bodies. Step up, get round the table and negotiate on pay.
How hopeful are you that we are going to not see just a winter of discontent, but that we're not going to see like a spring of discontent, a summer of discontent, and this carries on? Because I think a lot of us feel that there isn't any end in sight in this, especially we've got, you know, nurses going out on strike again, ambulance workers, as I say, we could see teachers going out on strike. Now, that has a massive impact then on pretty much everyone else. Doesn't matter how you get to work, you need people to go to work. We haven't got the childcare available for every parent whose kids are out of school. And you know, and we see doctors going on strike that will add to the problems in the NHS as well. This is sort of a I don't know, tsunami of strike action that's affecting everyone across the board. How hopeful are you that this can be resolved?
I'm extremely hopeful. I mean, I think if the Prime Minister took up our offer to meet, and if he allowed his ministers to negotiate meaningful improvements of public sector pay, we could end these strikes quickly. And I just reiterate the point, Julia. I was on those picket lines in Waterloo with paramedics. People who work day in, day out, caring for patients, some of the most vulnerable in our society, they don't want to be on strike, but they're very clear they can't afford another year of a real terms pay cut. So, as I say, I think the ball is very much in the Prime Minister's court. I hope he picks up that offer for talks, for urgent talks, but crucially, I hope that he allows his ministers to do the sensible thing, reach agreement with our unions. Let's move forward. And as I say, I think that would be the best thing for public sector workers, the best thing for public services, and the best thing for the UK economy overall.
Just finally, can I just ask you, when you put out this offer, was that just a public offer, or did you put a private phone call into number 10 and say, hi, can I have a meeting with the Prime Minister? And if so, what was the response?
Well, we haven't had a response yet, but to be fair, we only sent a letter yesterday. I did also send a letter directly to the Prime Minister. But I'd just say this, Julia. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, promised to meet the head of the TUC. That was about 5 or 6 weeks ago. We've chased his office now for a meeting. We've had no positive response. So, it really is incumbent, I think, on the government to take these issues seriously, to get round the table with us, to have a discussion. I say we represent millions of people up and down the country. We want their concerns heard, and we want the government to take them seriously.
I would say it was simply good manners to respond at the very least.
I wouldn't disagree.
Paul Novak, General Secretary of the TUC, thank you for joining us. Coming up to 9:18.